Raymond Jessup stood in the dim light of his living room, a place he had once thought was the epitome of comfort and love. The room, lined with family photos, wedding pictures, birthday celebrations, a child's first steps, seemed like a testament to everything he had worked for. But now, as his gaze lingered on the photographs, he felt a quiet unease in his chest. What had once been a source of pride now felt like a heavy weight. His eyes paused on a picture of him and Brenda, his wife, smiling in front of their home, their son in her arms. They looked happy, perfect even, but the truth of their life together felt more distant than ever. Raymond's fingers brushed the edges of the photo frame, his mind swirling. The woman in that photo, his wife, was a stranger to him now. The warmth in her eyes had faded months ago, replaced by something he couldn't quite place. Coldness, disinterest. Something was missing, and it gnawed at him more and more every day. He turned his head to the side and looked at the empty chair where Brenda usually sat after a long day. Silence. It had been a few weeks since things started to feel off. She'd come home late from work, barely speaking, as if she were avoiding him. The tenderness, the intimacy, had all but vanished. He had tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress, work, life, the usual distractions. But the nagging suspicion in the pit of his stomach wouldn't let him rest. Raymond didn't know how it had happened, but the cracks in their marriage were now so visible, so undeniable. He couldn't understand how he had missed them. Had it always been this way? Was he just blind to it? He walked across the room and sat down in the chair next to the window. Outside, the Texas sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the horizon. But Raymond's mind was elsewhere, replaying moments he had tried to dismiss. His mind drifted back to a few days ago when Brenda had come home late again. He'd been sitting on the couch waiting for her, a sense of dread building. When she walked through the door, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of her absence. She simply walked past him, kissed their son on the forehead, and sat down to eat without saying a word. That night, when he lay beside her in bed, Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really there, that he wasn't really there for her anymore. It was a slow erosion, a soft whisper of distance between them. But now, with the weight of this quiet absence pressing on his chest, he knew it was more than that. He could no longer ignore the truth that there was something, someone else. And it wasn't just a passing thought. It was something real, something undeniable. He'd caught her phone buzzing with a name he didn't recognize. It was a name that wouldn't leave his mind. Raymond closed his eyes, gripping the armrest of the chair. He tried to hold on to the image of his perfect family, but that image seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. His chest tightened as the weight of it all pressed down on him. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion. What was he supposed to do with all of it? He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with both hands. It felt like everything was falling apart. His marriage, his family, his sense of self. What had happened to the man who once believed in love above all else? "I should have seen it," he whispered, barely audible. He stood up and walked over to the window. The light from outside flickered, casting shadows on the walls. A sudden coldness washed over him, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Raymond's mind raced as the weight of his realization crashed down on him. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing everything. His family, his belief in love, his faith in the life they'd built together, and it was all because of her. He couldn't shake that thought, that burning feeling of betrayal that consumed him. His fingers gripped the windowsill as he looked out, feeling both trapped and helpless. A part of him wanted to scream, to confront her, but another part of him feared that the truth would be worse than anything he could imagine. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might find, but deep down, he knew he had to know. The life he had built was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a prison. Raymond couldn't escape the tension that hung in the air. It was like a slow burn in his chest, growing every time he looked at Brenda. Their conversations had become strained if they happened at all. The warmth that once filled the house had evaporated, replaced by an awkward silence. Every evening, Raymond would wait for Brenda to come home, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. He had tried to fill the void with routine, with small tasks that kept him busy, but the emptiness followed him everywhere. He watched the clock as the hours ticked by, knowing that once again, Brenda would come through the door late, tired, and distant. He had stopped asking questions. She'd always say she had a late meeting or there was something at work that needed her attention. At first, he believed her, But the lies had become too obvious, too frequent, and now they hung like a cloud over their home. Tonight was no different. He sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a newspaper, though his mind was far away. He heard the door open, and Brenda's soft footsteps in the hallway. She didn't greet him, didn't ask about his day. Instead, she walked past him, heading straight to their son's room to kiss him goodnight. Raymond's chest tightened as he watched her. There was no passion in the gesture, no joy in the way she touched their child's head, no love in her eyes when she glanced at him. It was robotic, cold, and it stung. After a few minutes, she returned to the kitchen, sitting down at the table across from him. Her eyes met his briefly, but it wasn't the same look she used to give him, full of warmth, curiosity, and love. It was flat, neutral, almost as if he were a stranger. "How was your day?" Raymond asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Brenda shrugged, her gaze drifting away from his. "Fine, nothing special." There it was again, the distance. That wall between them that seemed to grow every day. Raymond opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wanted to ask about the affair. He wanted to ask why she had become a stranger in their own home, but every time the words rose to his lips, they felt like a betrayal of something deeper, something he wasn't sure he could bear to hear. Instead, he picked at his food, pushing the fork around the plate. His mind raced with thoughts, but nothing could quiet the storm that churned inside him. He had seen the signs for weeks now, the late nights, the strange text messages, the distant expressions, the small excuses that added up to something far worse. And yet, here he was, sitting across from the woman who had once been his everything, unable to bridge the gap between them. "Brenda, we need to talk," Raymond finally said, his voice rough with emotion. She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stood up and rinsed her plate, avoiding the conversation he was desperately trying to have. "Not tonight, Raymond," she replied, her tone flat. "I'm tired." Raymond felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to scream, to demand the truth. He wanted her to look him in the eye and tell him what was really going on. But instead, he sat there, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. What had happened to them? What had happened to the love they once shared? She wasn't tired. She was hiding something. The truth was closing in on him, pressing against his chest with unbearable weight. But he couldn't force her to admit it. And the more he tried, the more he realized the woman sitting across from him was no longer the woman he had married. His thoughts were interrupted by her voice again. "I'm going to bed," Brenda said softly, as if this was just another ordinary night. Raymond nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she disappeared into their bedroom, he sat there in the kitchen, alone with his thoughts. How could he have missed it? How had he allowed himself to be so blind? He stayed up long into the night, replaying every moment, every conversation, every look. The woman he loved was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. His heart pounded as he realized something he had been avoiding for weeks. Brenda was no longer just distant. She had already checked out, and it was only a matter of time before the truth tore everything apart. Raymond's world, already fractured, was about to shatter completely. He hadn't meant to invade her privacy. But when Brenda's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, his curiosity consumed him. He hesitated for a moment, but the insistent ring of the phone drew his hand to it, almost of its own accord. It was a text message from someone named John. His pulse quickened. The message was brief, a simple line that made his stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place?" Raymond's breath caught in his throat. He had seen the name John before on the piece of paper Brenda had carelessly left out a few weeks ago. The same paper that had slipped from her purse when she was getting into the car. That same name. A pit formed in his stomach as he scrolled through the messages, his hand trembling. Each message confirmed his worst fears, as if the universe was pulling the last thread of his sanity apart. The casualness of it, the affection, the promises of stolen moments, all revealed a secret that had been hidden in plain sight. The anger that bubbled up inside him was suffocating, but it wasn't just anger. It was a mix of heartbreak and betrayal that left him breathless. His mind raced, trying to piece it all together, but the pieces didn't fit. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his marriage, was now a lie. Raymond snapped the phone shut and stood there, staring at the blank screen, unable to process what had just unfolded. He had already suspected something, but now there was undeniable proof. The woman he had loved, the woman who had been his everything, had been living a life that he was not a part of. The guilt gnawed at him, and yet a part of him felt relief, as twisted as that might sound. The truth had finally been exposed. But then, another realization hit him with full force. The child, our son. Was he even mine? He walked away from the kitchen, his mind spinning. The doubt had been creeping in for weeks, but now it was a concrete fear, a possibility that haunted him at every turn. How could he face this? How could he look at his son, who had been the center of his world, and not wonder? Raymond's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the countertop, his thoughts colliding like a storm in his head. He had been so blind. Had Brenda been lying to him all this time? Was everything a lie? His heart raced, each beat louder than the last. The silence of the house only made his thoughts more deafening. Every inch of the walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time in years, Raymond felt truly alone. He was suffocating under the weight of it all. "Raymond?" Brenda's voice came from the hallway, cutting through the silence. He froze. She was standing there, just a few steps away, her gaze falling on him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked distant, detached even. He didn't know what to say. How could he even begin to explain what he had just uncovered? The betrayal felt too vast, too deep to articulate. How could he make her understand the pain that now consumed him? She was standing there a few feet away, unaware of the chaos her lies had triggered. Raymond choked on the words, but they wouldn't come out. The truth was too much to confront. "Raymond, what's wrong?" she asked, taking a tentative step toward him. Her voice was softer than usual, but it didn't reach him. He couldn't look at her. In that moment, something inside him snapped. He couldn't hold it in anymore. His emotions, all the anger, the confusion, the pain, erupted. "Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you just tell me? Why have you been lying to me? All this time, Brenda, all this time. Was it all just a game to you?" Brenda flinched at the intensity of his words, her face paling as she took a step back. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Was it him?" Raymond spat, his heart in his throat. "Was it always him? And what about me, Brenda? Was I ever enough for you?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to speak, but the words never seemed to reach her lips. She turned away, her hand clenching around the doorframe as if trying to hold on to something real. I'm sorry, Raymond," she whispered, her voice so small, so broken. "I never meant for it to get like this." But it was too late. The walls had already come down, and as Raymond stared at the woman he thought he knew, all he could feel was the overwhelming, suffocating weight of her betrayal. The truth had been uncovered, and nothing would ever be the same again. Raymond couldn't breathe. The tension between him and Brenda was suffocating, a wall of unspoken words and broken trust. He stood there, unable to look at her, his mind swirling with all the questions he was too scared to ask. The discovery of Brenda's affair had shattered him, but there was something more lurking in the shadows, something he hadn't been prepared for. He had avoided it for as long as he could, convincing himself that there was still a chance for reconciliation, that maybe they could move past this, but the truth was now unavoidable, and it was darker than he ever imagined. "Raymond, please." Brenda's voice trembled. It was softer than he had ever heard it, a broken whisper that only made the weight of the situation more unbearable. "You don't understand." Raymond turned toward her, his anger boiling over, but the words lodged in his throat. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but there was no room left for reason. Every time he looked at her, he felt the betrayal cutting deeper. "Tell me the truth, Brenda," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "What else haven't you told me?" Her eyes flickered, a momentary hesitation before she finally spoke. "It's not just about him, about the affair." Raymond's heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down his spine. He stared at her, waiting for her to continue, but the silence stretched painfully between them. "Brenda, what are you talking about?" His voice cracked, desperate for answers. She shifted uncomfortably, biting her lip as if trying to find the courage to say what was lingering on the edge of her consciousness. She hesitated, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear, then finally looked at him. "The child, Raymond, the child we've raised together. He's not yours," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, the world around Raymond seemed to collapse. He felt the ground beneath him shift as if the very foundation of his life was crumbling. He didn't understand, didn't want to understand. He stood frozen, 1,000 thoughts crashing in his head, but none of them could make sense of what she had just said. "What?" Raymond's voice was barely a whisper, his heart pounding in his chest. Brenda's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want you to find out like this, but it's true. The child isn't yours. No." Raymond cut her off, his voice sharp and strained. "No, you're lying. You have to be lying." She shook her head, her lips quivering. "I never meant to hurt you, Raymond, but you deserve to know the truth. He's not your son." The words echoed in Raymond's mind like a cruel, distorted mantra. He looked at her, his hands shaking, as everything he had believed in, the love, the trust, the family, slipped through his fingers like sand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was unbearable, suffocating. Raymond's world, the one he had built so carefully, was crumbling before his eyes. All the years they had spent together, the memories they had made, had been built on lies. "How could you?" Raymond's voice cracked with disbelief. His chest tightened as the reality of the situation set in. "How could you do this to me? To our family? I thought we had everything." Brenda's sobs were quiet, her shoulders shaking as she turned away from him. She couldn't look at him anymore, couldn't bear the weight of his gaze, but Raymond couldn't turn away. The truth was out, and he couldn't escape it, no matter how much he wished he could. The child they had raised together, the boy he had called his son, was not his. The sense of betrayal he felt was suffocating, more intense than anything he had ever experienced. And yet, as he stood there staring at Brenda, part of him wanted to believe her. Part of him wanted to find a way to forgive her, to pretend like everything was normal again. But he knew he couldn't. Everything had changed. The life he had known was gone, replaced by a stark, unforgiving truth. And there was no going back. Raymond turned away from her, his heart shattered into pieces. He couldn't look at her anymore. He couldn't be in the same room with her. The love he had once felt for her now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a bitter anger that burned deep within him. Brenda's voice reached him one last time. "I'm sorry, Raymond. I wish things could have been different." But Raymond didn't hear her anymore. The only thing that mattered now was the hollow ache in his chest, the realization that everything he had built had been a lie. The days following Brenda's confession were a blur for Raymond. He moved through them like a ghost, unable to escape the suffocating reality that had replaced his life. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on him, and it seemed impossible to breathe without feeling its crushing force. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Brenda's betrayal had torn apart everything he believed in, his marriage, his family, and his very sense of self. The lie that had been fed to him for years was now a bitter poison, swirling in his veins, making him feel hollow and lost. The house was silent, as though it too could feel the tension. Brenda had grown more withdrawn since that night, retreating into herself. She no longer tried to explain herself, no longer begged for forgiveness. The silence between them had become their language, more potent than any words could have been. Raymond found himself caught in a storm of emotions. Anger and sadness clashed within him like two titans, neither one willing to back down. There were moments when he wanted to scream, to confront Brenda with the full force of his rage, to make her feel the weight of the destruction she had caused. But every time he looked at her, he found himself paralyzed by a deep, aching sense of betrayal. She had been so close to him. They had built a life together, his dreams, her dreams, their shared memories, and now it was all a lie. But it wasn't just Brenda that he was angry with. It was himself, too, for not seeing it, for not noticing the signs that had been there all along. How had he been so blind? How had he let his love for her blind him to the cracks in their marriage, the subtle shift in her behavior that now seemed so obvious? The guilt clawed at him. He had failed to protect his family, and worse, he had failed to protect himself. Raymond couldn't stop thinking about their son, the child he had raised as his own, the child who had called him Dad, with a smile that had once filled his heart with pride. Was he really his son? Was he even part of him, or was that too a lie? The thought gnawed at his soul, pulling him deeper into a pit of despair. He had spent so many years loving this child, believing he was his own flesh and blood. Now the truth had shattered that illusion. Could he still love him? Could he still be the father he had always been? The pressure was building inside him, threatening to break him apart. He needed answers, but he was too afraid to ask the one question that lingered in his mind. He couldn't ask Brenda about it, not yet. He wasn't ready to face that particular truth. The fear of what it might do to him, to their family, was too much to bear. Raymond tried to distract himself to find some small measure of peace, but it was futile. Everywhere he went, he was haunted by the weight of his thoughts. He couldn't escape them. There was no relief from the anxiety that twisted his stomach into knots. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the child. It was everything. The life he had built with Brenda, the trust they had shared, and the future they had imagined. All of it had been shattered in an instant, and he didn't know how to put the pieces back together. He tried to talk to Brenda once, hoping for some kind of resolution, but the conversation had been empty, like a hollow echo. She apologized again, but the words felt meaningless now. It was too late for apologies. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo it. Raymond felt suffocated by the weight of it all. His world was collapsing around him, and he didn't know how to fix it. He had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now he felt weak, lost. Every choice he made seemed to lead him further into despair, and so he retreated. He shut himself off from the world, from Brenda, from their son. He spent his days alone, drowning in his thoughts, consumed by the pressure building inside him. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined now by something darker, something he couldn't name. It was a deep sadness, a grief that felt like it was crushing him from the inside out. Raymond had reached a breaking point. The pressure was unbearable, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold it in. Raymond's mind was a storm, a chaotic whirlwind that refused to calm. Every day felt like a battle, as if the very essence of his existence was being stripped away. He had thought the worst had already happened, that the discovery of Brenda's affair and the revelation about their child would be the breaking points. But the pressure inside him continued to build, intensifying with each passing hour. The anger was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, but now it was tangled with something else. A growing sense of despair, like a weight in his chest, was making it harder to breathe. His thoughts raced faster than he could process them. The lies, the betrayal, the emptiness, it was all consuming him. Raymond hadn't left the house in days. He stayed in the dimly lit rooms, avoiding Brenda, avoiding their son. He couldn't look at either of them without the sharp sting of betrayal cutting through him. The child, his son, had never felt so distant. The thought that he might not be his own flesh and blood gnawed at him constantly. Could he still be a father to him? Could he ever trust again? He couldn't escape it. Every corner of the house felt like a trap, each room a reminder of everything he had lost. The once familiar and comforting surroundings were now foreign, suffocating. He couldn't think clearly anymore. His mind felt clouded and the fog wouldn't lift. He was drowning in his own thoughts. That night, it happened again. Brenda came home late, as she always did now. Her presence barely registered with Raymond as she moved about the house, but it was the phone, always the phone, that caught his attention. It buzzed on the counter, and his heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted toward it, a gut feeling telling him that it was something he couldn't ignore. He stood up slowly. His feet felt like they were sinking into the floor as he approached the phone. His hands were shaking, but he couldn't stop himself. He reached out and picked it up. It was a message from John. His blood ran cold as he read the words, barely able to comprehend them. "Can't wait to see you again. Tomorrow night, same time." The text was brief, but it was all he needed. The last shred of his sanity snapped. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and he almost couldn't breathe. His pulse was pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to do something, anything. But he was paralyzed. This was it. Raymond's fingers gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The anger surged up like a tidal wave, drowning everything in its path. But beneath the anger, something darker was taking hold, something that terrified him more than he could explain. What if I lost control? He turned toward Brenda, who was now in the living room, oblivious to his spiraling thoughts. She was humming softly to herself, too caught up in her own world to notice the storm that was building within him. Raymond stood there for a moment, frozen, his chest tight with a mix of emotions he could no longer control. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to fight to keep them steady. The phone slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The thought of confronting her again, of asking her for the 1,000th time why she had done this, seemed useless now. He knew the truth, but that didn't stop the rage from boiling over, didn't stop the suffocating feeling of helplessness that wrapped around his throat. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His steps were heavy as he approached her, each footfall echoing in the silence. He stopped just short of her, standing in the doorway. She looked up at him, her expression calm, like nothing had changed, like everything was normal. But it wasn't. "Brenda," Raymond said, his voice raw with emotion, "I can't do this anymore." She blinked, surprised by the intensity in his tone, but she didn't answer. She looked at him for a long moment, almost as if she was waiting for him to say more, but the words were stuck in his throat. "I know everything," he whispered. "I know about John." Her face drained of color, and for the first time in days he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and fear. But it was too late. The words were out, and there was no taking them back. "I know about our son," he continued, his voice breaking. "I know. He's not mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda didn't speak. She didn't move. Her lips trembled as she fought to find the words, but nothing came. Raymond's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had never felt so helpless, so trapped. The walls were closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of it all. He reached for her, desperate to make her understand the depth of the pain she had caused him. But as he touched her arm, something snapped inside him. It wasn't her he was angry at anymore. It was himself. And for a brief moment, Raymond didn't know if he could control what came next. The anger, the confusion, the pain, it was all too much. He couldn't hold it in anymore. Raymond stood in the middle of the living room, his body rigid, his breath shallow. He had reached the edge of his mind, the edge of his marriage, the edge of his own sanity. The rage had consumed him, and yet now, in this rare and quiet moment, something shifted. Something deep within him began to settle. Brenda had just left the room after their confrontation, her footsteps fading down the hallway. She hadn't said much, just a few broken words of apology, but they felt empty. They all felt empty now. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, they had all built up to this unsustainable point, and yet, in the silence that followed her departure, Raymond was left with something far more powerful: clarity. His chest tightened as he looked at the floor. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, but in the stillness, the weight of it all began to break apart. He wasn't angry anymore, not the way he had been. He was something else. He felt a cold emptiness, a hollowness inside that had swallowed him whole. His mind cleared, and in that space of unexpected clarity, the full weight of his situation began to land. This wasn't just about Brenda. Raymond had spent so much time focusing on her betrayal, on the lies that had twisted his world, that he had ignored the truth about himself. He had been so angry, so desperate for answers, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he truly wanted, what he truly needed. The truth about their son, the affair, Brenda's deceit. It was all intertwined with something far darker within him. It wasn't just about her. It was about his own inability to see the cracks in his own life. How had he allowed himself to ignore the subtle signs? How had he let his desperation for a perfect family blind him to the truth? The pressure that had built in his chest was now giving way to something different, something quieter, and it scared him. In this moment, Raymond realized that his anger was a mask. Beneath it was something more profound, a deep, aching sadness that he hadn't let himself feel until now. A sadness that came from seeing everything he thought he knew about love and trust turn to dust. Raymond collapsed onto the couch, his hands gripping the fabric as his mind wandered. He thought about their life together, the good moments, the fleeting ones that had seemed so important at the time. He thought about the son he had raised, the child who now felt so far away, the child who, no matter what, he could never look at the same way again. The truth that he had so desperately avoided was now glaring in front of him, and though he had never expected to be standing in this place, in this moment, he knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't change the past, and there was no magic fix for the damage that had been done. But there was something else, a choice to finally look at everything, the betrayal, the lies, the pain, and choose to move forward, no matter how painful the process would be. A strange sense of calm washed over him, not because he had found answers, but because he understood that no answers would come from holding on to the rage. There was no justice in anger. It wasn't going to fix the lies. It wasn't going to bring back the family he once had. It was time to let go. It was time to accept that everything had changed. Raymond looked at the photograph on the mantel, the one of him and Brenda smiling, their son in her arms. It felt like a different life, a dream he had once lived. But dreams didn't last forever, and sometimes letting go of them was the only way to move on. For the first time in what felt like forever, Raymond closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. It was a painful release, but it was necessary. There was no going back, but there was still a future. He didn't know what that future looked like, or how long it would take to find peace, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to stop looking at the past. Raymond wiped his eyes, the clarity still ringing in his ears. He stood up, his body feeling heavy but grounded. He had made a choice, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was the only path that could lead him out of the darkness. The air was thick with tension. Raymond stood in the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. It had been building for days, the anger, the confusion, the sorrow. But now, it was time to confront Brenda for the final time. He had already known everything, her affair, the lie about their son, but he couldn't stop the flood of emotions that surged through him. The years of shared life, of trust, now felt like a distant, fragile memory. He couldn't bear to look at her the way he had, couldn't pretend that everything was still okay. Brenda was sitting at the kitchen table when he finally approached her. She didn't look up at first. She had been quiet, distant for so long now, but Raymond could feel her presence in the room, feel the shift between them as if the very walls were closing in. "Brenda," Raymond said, his voice shaky but firm. Her head snapped up, her eyes immediately falling to his hands, clenched at his sides. She had known this moment was coming. They both had. The silence between them had grown unbearable, but no words could fix what had been broken. Raymond took a deep breath. "We need to talk about everything." Brenda's face tightened. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but stopped herself. Instead, she nodded slowly, eyes cast downward. She was waiting for him to speak, but Raymond wasn't sure if he even had the strength to. "I know about him," Raymond said, his voice cold and distant. "I know about the affair, and I know that he is the father of our son." The words hung in the air like a weight. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to speak the truth out loud, but it was out there now. He had nothing left to hide from her. And yet, in this moment, he realized that it wasn't just about the affair or the paternity of their child. It was about everything, the lies, the betrayal, the erosion of trust. "I loved you," Raymond continued, his voice cracking. "I trusted you. We had a family, a life, and now I don't even know who you are anymore." Brenda didn't respond immediately, her eyes filled with tears. But she didn't wipe them away. She had long since stopped fighting for their marriage. She had let him see the lies, the betrayal, and now she couldn't look at him without the overwhelming shame weighing on her chest. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted any of this. I never meant to hurt you." Raymond felt the sting of her words. They were the same words she had said to him before, apologies, regret. But they were empty now. Empty because the truth was undeniable. "No, Brenda," Raymond said, his voice growing stronger. "You didn't want to hurt me, but you did, and you have hurt me, more than you can imagine." He could feel the anger building again, the heat of it flooding his chest. It was a fiery, searing thing that wanted to consume him, wanted to tear at everything in sight. But then, in the midst of the rage, something else rose within him, a deep, gnawing sadness. For the first time in a long time, Raymond realized that it wasn't just Brenda who had betrayed him. He had betrayed himself. He had ignored all the signs, all the little moments where something felt wrong. He had refused to see the cracks because he didn't want to believe that the woman he loved could ever hurt him like this. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "I gave you everything," Raymond said, his voice low, the hurt bleeding through. "I gave you my trust, my heart, but you took it all and destroyed it." Brenda's lip trembled as she stood up, moving toward him. Her hand reached out, but Raymond stepped back, unable to bear her touch. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of regret and fear, but Raymond couldn't bring himself to soften. "Raymond, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far," Brenda stammered, the tears now flowing freely down her face. "I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt lost, and I made a terrible mistake." "I don't want to hear it," Raymond snapped, his voice cutting through the air. He turned away, unable to face her anymore. His chest tightened, suffocating him with the weight of it all. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, with years of unresolved hurt and betrayal. The man he had been, the man who had once believed in love, in family, felt so far removed from the man he was now. Raymond's heart felt like it was breaking, But he knew deep down that he couldn't keep holding on to the past. The woman in front of him wasn't the woman he had married, and the family they had once dreamed of wasn't real anymore. The love, the trust, it was all gone, and there was no going back. "I can't do this anymore, Brenda," Raymond whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. "It's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, he turned and walked away from her. His heart ached with each step, but he knew it was the only way forward. The final confrontation had come, and there was nothing left to say. The silence in the house was suffocating. After Raymond had walked away from Brenda, he had retreated into a cold, empty space of his own making. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. He hadn't said goodbye. There had been no final words of closure, no apologies. It was just over. And now, as the days passed, Raymond found himself trapped in the aftermath, struggling to breathe under the weight of everything that had happened. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison. The walls, which had witnessed years of laughter, love, and family moments, now seemed to echo with nothing but loss. Every corner felt like a reminder of the life he had lost. Raymond wandered aimlessly through the house, unable to shake the haunting emptiness that consumed him. The photographs on the walls, pictures of their wedding, their son's first steps, family vacations, no longer felt like memories of happiness. They felt like a distant dream, something that had once been real but was now nothing more than a cruel illusion. He found himself standing in front of the photo of him and Brenda, their arms wrapped around each other, smiles frozen in time. How could he have been so blind? How had he not seen the cracks, the distance, the slow unraveling of everything they had worked so hard to build? He wanted to believe it wasn't true. He wanted to believe that the love they shared was real, that the family they had created was not built on lies. But the truth had already been exposed, and there was no going back. Raymond could hear Brenda moving in the other room, but he didn't go to her. He didn't know if he ever would again. The guilt and anger that had consumed him were slowly being replaced by something else, numbness. The days blurred together. He stopped going to work, stopped doing the things that used to fill his time. He felt like a shell of himself, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. There was no place for him in the world anymore, no place for the man he had been. Brenda, too, seemed lost. She was quieter than ever, retreating into herself. Raymond could feel her presence in the house, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like an intruder, like the last remnants of something broken beyond repair. One evening, Raymond found himself sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television, though he wasn't watching it. His mind was a swirl of confusion, regret, and fear. He had no idea what to do next, no idea where to go from here. Brenda came into the room, her footsteps tentative, as if she were unsure of what to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Raymond," Brenda finally said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I never meant for this to happen. I wish I could take it all back." Raymond didn't answer. He couldn't. What was there to say? The words felt hollow now. The apologies, the regrets. It was all too little, too late. Brenda sat down across from him, but there was no warmth in the gesture. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't try to comfort him. It was as if they were strangers now, two people who had once shared everything, but had now lost each other in the darkness. "I don't know what to do," Brenda whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I never wanted to lose you. I never wanted to hurt you." Raymond's chest tightened. He wanted to feel something, anything, but the emptiness inside him was all-consuming. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. He had tried for so long to hold everything together, but now it was all slipping through his fingers. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he finally said, his voice breaking. Brenda flinched as if his words were a physical blow. She started to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. Raymond stood up, unable to sit there any longer. He couldn't look at her without seeing the lies, without feeling the betrayal that had shattered everything. "I need to be alone," he said, his voice rough. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy. The door to the backyard was ajar, and he stepped outside, feeling the cool evening air wash over him. It did little to calm the storm inside, but for a moment, it was enough to make him feel something other than numb. He stood there, staring at the darkening sky, wondering what his life would be like now. Could he ever move past this? Could he ever trust again? The silence of the night was the only answer. Raymond sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, his hands clenched tightly together, staring straight ahead. The weight of the situation bore down on him like a suffocating cloud. The trial had begun, and every word, every gesture, seemed to amplify the disaster of his life. The walls of the courtroom felt too small, too confining. He was no longer just a man who had been betrayed. He was now a man under the unforgiving spotlight of public scrutiny. His mind felt detached from his body. He barely heard the opening statements, the prosecutor's voice cutting through the air, accusing him of brutality and coldness. The media frenzy had made sure the entire town, and far beyond, was aware of the details. Cameras flashed constantly, their incessant clicks punctuating every moment, seizing his every expression, every breath. The public had their opinions already. Some believed Raymond was a victim, a man who had been pushed to the brink by his wife's betrayal. Others saw him as a villain, a man who snapped and turned violent in a moment of weakness, incapable of controlling his rage. No one seemed to care about the truth, only the narrative they wanted to believe. Brenda sat across from him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow, but also fear. Raymond couldn't look at her anymore without feeling the searing pain of everything that had happened. She had been the one to break him, but now he was here, forced to answer for what had happened after the lies came to light. The tears, the apologies, none of it seemed to matter now. The courtroom was a blur of voices, of accusations and counter-arguments, but Raymond's thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't need to hear the words to know what people thought of him. His life was in shambles, and now it was being paraded out for public consumption. The defense attorney, a well-groomed man with an air of practiced sympathy, stood to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must understand that this man did not commit murder out of malice. No, his actions were the result of an emotional breakdown, caused by the betrayal of his wife, the woman he loved and trusted." Raymond closed his eyes as if trying to block out the words. He had been driven by something that he could barely even comprehend. An overwhelming rage, a need to reclaim something, anything, in the face of a life that had been destroyed. But the more they spoke of his emotions, the less he felt they understood. The truth was too raw, too painful to acknowledge in that room. The affair, the lies, the devastation. And now, sitting here, he was being asked to answer for it all. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the prosecutor stood up, ready to make her case. She was poised and determined, the kind of person who thrived on the conflict, who reveled in making the accused squirm under the weight of her words. "This was not a moment of passion," she said, her voice ringing out. "This was a cold, calculated act. A man who was consumed by his own anger, who found it easier to destroy than to heal." Raymond flinched as the words hit him, but they didn't surprise him. He had known what the prosecution would say, and he had prepared himself for the worst. Still, hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the accusations of coldness and brutality, felt like a physical blow. It made the raw wound inside him ache even more. Outside, the media circus raged. Reporters clamored for any scrap of information, their microphones thrust at anyone willing to speak. Brenda's family had already spoken to the press, painting Raymond as a monster who had destroyed their daughter's life. His family remained silent, unwilling to be dragged into the mud of this public spectacle. Raymond felt the eyes of the room on him, but he didn't look up. Instead, he stared at his hands, knowing the damage was already done. He couldn't take it back. No matter what the jury decided, the truth was already out there, beyond the courtroom, swirling in the public's eyes and ears. The judge called for a break, and Raymond slowly stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He felt sick, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold before his eyes. He barely heard the murmurs of the crowd as he walked past them, his thoughts consumed with the chaos he had created. The courtroom doors closed behind him, and for a moment the silence was overwhelming. The weight of the trial pressed down on him like a vice, but Raymond knew he was more than just a man accused of a crime. He was a man who had lost everything, his family, his identity, his faith in the world. Now he was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions, and the world seemed to be watching every move he made. As he walked back to the holding room, the real weight of it all sank in. He didn't know if he was guilty or innocent anymore. He just knew that nothing would ever be the same. The courtroom was still, an oppressive silence hanging in the air. Raymond sat at the defendant's table, his gaze fixed straight ahead, though his mind was far from focused. He had been here before during the trial, Every word, every accusation, every piece of evidence felt like a slow, inexorable march toward this moment. But now, as the jury deliberated, everything seemed distant, unreal. The weight of what was about to come was unbearable. His chest tightened, his hands clammy from the sweat that had accumulated under his palms. He could barely feel his legs, stiff from the hours of sitting in the uncomfortable chair. His world, which had seemed so clear before, now felt distorted, shattered beyond recognition. The judge's voice broke through his haze, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Will the defendant please rise for the verdict?" Raymond didn't move immediately. The words felt like they were floating in the air, unreal, as if the moment wasn't really happening. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. His head spun as the courtroom doors swung open, the jury entering. The foreman stepped forward, the heavy silence intensifying with each passing second. Raymond's heart thudded in his chest, the pounding like a drum in his ears. He barely heard the foreman's voice when it came. It was as if the words were sinking into his skin, pushing him further into the inevitable reality he had been avoiding. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Raymond's body stiffened, his breath caught in his throat. He blinked, trying to process the gravity of what he had just heard. Guilty. He had been expecting it. Part of him had known, had braced himself for this. But hearing the words, seeing the grim expression on the judge's face, made it feel all too real. His knees nearly buckled beneath him, but he held himself upright. The room swam in front of his eyes as a sense of detachment settled over him. The judge's voice continued, but Raymond could barely hear the rest. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Life. The word reverberated in his mind, its meaning sinking into the pit of his stomach. A life sentence. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His world had just collapsed around him, reduced to a single, inescapable truth. His hands were shaking now, the weight of the verdict pressing down on him with an intensity he hadn't expected. He had thought that hearing the words would somehow bring relief, closure even, but they only intensified the suffocating feeling that had been building inside him for weeks. He glanced over at Brenda, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, her face pale, her eyes wide and distant. She hadn't even looked at him during the verdict. The anger that had once boiled inside him now seemed insignificant. All that remained was a cold numbness, a bitter emptiness that swallowed everything. Raymond was led away by the officers, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The sound of footsteps echoed in his ears, the clatter of chains a constant reminder that he was no longer a free man. He had lost everything, his family, his dignity, his future. But the worst part was that he had lost himself. He didn't know who he was anymore. The man he had been, the man who had loved and trusted so deeply, was gone. And now, the man who stood in front of the jury was nothing more than a shadow of the person he once was. As they escorted him out of the courtroom, the world outside seemed impossibly far away. His future, whatever it was, lay behind bars. And for the first time, Raymond truly understood the weight of his choices. Raymond sat in the small, cold cell, the walls closing in on him like a suffocating weight. His future had been decided, life in prison without parole. The sounds of the prison, distant chatter, the clinking of chains, the echoes of doors slamming, filled the silence around him. It had only been a few weeks since the trial, but the realization that he was now confined to these walls, these bars, had already sunk deep into his bones. He had never imagined his life would end this way. When he had been a husband, a father, he had thought that everything was within reach, that happiness, stability, and love were things that were meant to stay with him forever. Now, sitting in the darkness, he could see the stark contrast. The man who had once believed in the importance of family was gone, replaced by a prisoner of his own mistakes. It had been hard, harder than he had ever imagined, to face the reality of what he had done. It wasn't just the affair, it wasn't just Brenda's betrayal. It was the fact that he had let his rage and despair lead him to a place where there was no return. He had taken a life, and now the consequences were his to bear. Each day felt like 1,000. He spent most of his time alone, the quiet of his cell a reflection of the emptiness that consumed him. But there were moments, small moments, when the weight of his actions would flood back. He'd remember the look in Brenda's eyes as he walked away from her. Remember the sound of her voice calling out to him, asking for forgiveness, even though deep down, She knew it was too late. It was the hardest thing he'd ever had to face, that no apology could undo the destruction. No apology could bring back what had been lost. His marriage, his family, his son, gone. And now, he would never get the chance to rebuild it. There would be no second chances. In the quiet moments, Raymond found himself thinking about his son. He hadn't seen him since that night. The night everything had shattered. The boy he had raised as his own. The child who had called him dad without question. Was he still angry? Was he confused? Or had he already forgotten him, moving on with life without the man who had once been his father? It was a thought that gnawed at him, but Raymond didn't know how to fix it. There was no fixing it. Not now. But even in the darkness of his cell, Raymond knew something had changed in him. The anger that had consumed him for so long, the bitterness that had festered inside, was starting to fade. There was something else, something quieter, softer, emerging in its place. Guilt, yes, but also a flicker of something that felt like remorse. A desire to make amends, to find peace, even if it was just within himself. Raymond had always believed that redemption was something far off, something unattainable for someone like him. But now, sitting in the emptiness, he realized that maybe redemption wasn't about others forgiving him. It wasn't about Brenda or his son. It was about forgiving himself. But that, too, would take time. He had started to attend the prison's counseling sessions, sitting in the small, overcrowded room with other men who had made their own mistakes. He didn't speak much, but listening to the stories of others made him realize he wasn't alone, that despite everything, there was a path forward. Not an easy one, not a quick one, but a path nonetheless. He didn't know where that path would lead him. Maybe it would lead to some kind of peace. Maybe it wouldn't. But Raymond had learned something he hadn't known before. Redemption wasn't given. It was earned. And for the first time, he was willing to try. But for now, the silence of his cell was all he had. The quiet stillness of a man who had lost everything, yet was willing to try to rebuild whatever fragments remained inside him. What do you think of Raymond's journey through betrayal and redemption? From which region are you watching this video? If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to follow all our stories, and be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thank you for watching.